I'm sorry that we can't all gather in person, but thank you again. And following Tanya, I mean, what an absolute honor. I would like to start by saying that I am located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyagahaga Nation is located as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we in Quebec gather today. The Tiohtià:ke, which is known as Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. And thank you for the land acknowledgement at the beginning. I'm going to now share my slides. Now, I'm going to be talking quite a bit about myself, and I would just love to know more about you. Unfortunately, we can't, sit and have a coffee as one normally would in conferences, but let me know what you're listening to. What are some podcasts that you like? Put it in the chat. I don't know if you have a science fact, let me know. Or just, let me know anything that you'd like to share. So I'm sure you're asking, all right, what is she going to be talking about for the next 40 minutes? So I'm going to just start off by, my origin story of stumbling into science communication, how that happened, what is science communication, specifically inclusive science communication, which is a passion of mine. And then I'd like to just share some tips and resources, but also acknowledge some of the barriers for why we need to start creating more inclusive spaces when it comes to science communication, and then ultimately talk about the power that you have as graduate students, because that is not often celebrated or talked about. Okay. So that's me, looking fresh, looking really happy, really loved school at that point. And so when I was a kid, I absolutely adored science. My top 3 jobs, which I was asked when I was in grade 1, was I wanted to be Dr. Maida. So Dr. Maida was my pediatrician, and I thought all pediatricians were called Dr. Maida. I wanted to be a spy. And I also wanted to live in the museum. Specifically, I wanted to live in the Ontario Science Centre, but also the Royal Ontario Museum, because I loved looking at all the dinosaurs and the mummies. Now, flash forward to today. I am a very tired graduate student. Here I wear a lot of hats there. So my main research is I try to understand why youth with autism, youth with neurodevelopmental disorders have increased sleep problems, risk for increased sleep problems. So I look at genetics, I work in the clinic, I do some longitudinal modeling of clinical data. But on the side, I have this kind of other life, this side hustle of science communication. I started Broad Science, which I'll talk about in a few slides. As Jan mentioned, I became a CBC columnist recently. And then last year, or rather, I started this year in January, I became a science communication lecturer. So I want to talk about how did I get from a kid who loved science to doing, science communication work, which I'm assuming all of you are here because you're interested in that or doing it in some capacity. So when I was in university, I went on to study science, biology, cognitive psychology, and I studied, memorized, regurgitated. I got good grades, and I thought, I'm doing science right. All the love for science that my parents fostered in me, I was now trying to pursue into a career. But the higher up that I got into academia, whether that was in high school, going to maybe camps, or in my undergraduate chemistry classes, I noticed that there were not a lot of people that looked like me. And so I knew going into graduate school that I would be isolated feeling isolated in some way, but I expected that. What I didn't expect was during my master's having this complete feeling of, is the scientific method objective? I had never questioned that before. I never critically thought about science being biased in any way. And I thought, like most, that we have the gold standard. We have truth on our side. Now, I'm sitting in a class learning about chronic pain models or the neurobiology behind pain. And all the studies that we're reading are done on male mice. I think at that time when I was a master's student, about 70% of studies on pain models were done using male mice. And I thought, that's really weird. Aren't the majority of chronic pain patients women? How does that impact our approach to treatment or just understanding the diversity of biology and how pain might differ between those biologies? But no one was talking to me about this. No one was pushing me to critically think about this. And then I start working on large data sets and noticing, the majority of the people in these data sets are middle to upper class. They're European ancestry. They're not people that look like my family or the communities that I grew up in. So who is my science benefiting, right? I'm a genetics researcher, and currently the data sets that we work on, these large genome-wide association studies, 80% of those databases are folks with European ancestry who make up 16% of the world, right? And I was never really thought to critically think about this up till that point in my education, where I was like, I'm not really represented in the way science is not only produced and how we question things, but in the way that data is analyzed. And then in parallel to that, I started listening to a lot of podcasts at that time. I know Serial was really big, but I found shows like Radio Lab and just a bunch of science shows. And I was starting to notice the same thing. It was this lack of diversity in storytelling, but just also, when we in just the media generally as racialized or marginalized folks, if we were included in these stories, it was never from this frame of empowerment. It was often, there was something wrong with us, right? And here I am as a master's student absorbing all of this, going, something needs to change. Is anyone doing anything? And I wanted to tackle this question of, how can we reimagine science spaces so it is inclusive of, representative of the world that we live in. So at that time, I started writing a little bit for the school newspaper, just kind of short science explainers. And then I made my way to the community radio station beside McGill University, and just started learning some techniques from the community radio station, volunteering there. And then I chatted to a friend and I thought, maybe we can be the ones to tell the stories that we in our community want to hear about. And so we thought, okay, how hard is it to make like a podcast episode? I'm sure, we can be NPR or CBC, and it was hard. It was so difficult. We went into it with literally no skill sets and thought that we could create an episode that sounded professional, but didn't realize the amount of work, but also these huge teams that you have who work on podcasts. So it was, two friends and myself who were trying to essentially start a podcast, knowing nothing about it, but having community radio support, often undervalued resource. And gotta love community radio, who really did help us get there. And so we started Broad Science, which was an initiative to make science more engaging, inclusive, and accessible through audio and through podcasting. So we both did radio, and everything that we produced on the radio was then accessed through podcasts. Now, our flagship really started off with documentaries, which I'll play you a little clip of soon. And we really wanted to have these science topics and these stories being led by folks who are often historically underrepresented, currently underrepresented in science and the media. And so those were deep dives on a specific topic, like chronic pain. And then we since branched out to have other projects, including a youth program, which I'll talk about in a few slides, and storytelling evenings. So we've done a few audio documentaries, as I mentioned, on a variety of topics. I'm just going to play you a clip of a trailer for one of the two-part episodes that we did, looking at direct-to-consumer DNA, so things like 23andMe, and how it impacts different marginalized and racialized groups.
Join us this October for the first season of Broad Science, where we wind our way through the complicated social life of DNA.
In my mind, limiting the definition of an Indigenous person to DNA only is a very colonial concept.
During the series, we look into the billion-dollar industry of direct-to-consumer DNA testing.
The relationship between science and their ideology is a very urgent topic for a lot of white nationalists. I think they're looking for ways to justify what they see as true.
We ask, how did it get popular so quickly? Why do diverse groups of people use them? And what can those percentages really tell us about us?
Why would African Americans in particular be willing to put a tissue sample in a FedEx envelope and send it to a laboratory and expect that this space of scientific analysis and inference could send back to them reliable information about who they are?
We'll hear personal narratives about DNA and identity.
His article was HuffPost writer horrified to find out that she was white, which was not true. I'm not horrified to find out that I'm white at all. I was surprised.
We also asked leading academics in the field who shed some light on the impact of DNA testing on our society.
They appropriated the land, they appropriated the mineral resources. Now they're trying to appropriate our DNA or our biological resources into their settler claims to own and control and have the right to everything.
Check out broadscience.org for more on the upcoming series.
Okay, so that was a little taste of the approach that we took with our audio documentaries. And so what I really loved about what we were able to create is that it was based on recognizing the various expertise when it comes to talking about science. So we didn't although we sought to increase the diversity of scientific experts in our in our episodes, we also really wanted to emphasize that we didn't hold experts like academics on a pedestal, that we believed people's lived experience, that the community's perspectives of what was happening to them and their relation to the science that we were talking about was equally as, should equally be seen as an expertise, right? And as Tanya mentioned, I mean, this process for us, especially because we were so novice, took an incredible amount of time and love. I mean, months went into creating these, from researching to, you know, forming relationships with our guests. So, you know, for one episode, we would have experts who were like, hey, yeah, I can do this interview in like a day. Let's go, let's book it. And then for some of our episodes, particularly for community members, we had to spend months cultivating relationships. And it was a really sobering experience, because as someone who isn't a journalist, who's just a grad student who was like, we need more voices that are representative of science and the impact of science in society, I just assumed that, you know, trust would be there somehow. And I don't even think I think it was just an afterthought. And so here I was, a young graduate student, cultivating relationships with, for instance, an Indigenous woman who was going through a court battle because of the lack of acknowledgement for her status, or, you know, cultivating this relationship with a woman who took a 23andMe test and wrote about it and got viciously harassed and was sent death threats from right-wing terrorists. And so we, as graduate students, had this enormous power to tell these folks' stories, but we had to learn how to listen and how to work with them to tell it in a way that was true and representative of their experience. And then, like I said, we branched out into doing youth programming. So we started a Broad Science Youth Radio Workshop, where we work with underserved kids from the Montreal area. They come into the CKUT radio station, that community radio station that I was telling you about, and they become science journalists for the day. So they get to meet a scientist, they learn how to research, create questions, learn about mixing and producing. I mean, not a very high level, but they get to play around with some of the equipment, which is always fun for them. But, you know, what I really love about this workshop is that it allows them to explore their curiosity in a way that isn't put in this educational box that they're usually in. You know, we're not grading them. We're just saying, hey, tell us what you want to learn about. And what's really awesome is that they don't just talk to the scientists about their science, but they ask them about them as humans, and not just hearing about their successes, but things that they have failed at, their whole journey. You know, these kids ask incredibly complex questions. I'm going to play just a brief clip that always makes me smile here.
This is Davin and Jacob on CKUT 90.3 FM. Today we are with Dr. Truong on the topic of artificial intelligence and language. My sister was reading this book and she read part of it to me. It was called Future You by Andy Walker. And there was this interesting part that anyone who has a microchip or pacemaker counts as a cyborg. So would that technically mean that robots are alive halfway, or would that mean just that humans are half robot?
What an incredibly complex question. You know, and people literally people do their PhD on this. What is the impact of technology on us as humans? Does that redefine what it means to be human? And so again, this space allows them to ask these complex questions, allows for their abilities to not be underestimated, and also to have questions about or kind of discuss things that they don't normally get to talk about in school, maybe things that, you know, impact them. So a lot of them were fearful about climate change and what was happening. A lot of them got to talk about disorders in their families. And so, you know, this has been a wonderful program, and I think the audio bit has really been incredibly helpful because they've had to really think about the different words that they want to use. They also get to pick different roles that suit their perceived abilities the best. So some of them are natural, like, let me take the mic and I've got this. Others are writers, others like to control the volume. And so it is a wonderful inclusive environment. And I should say that we are, this is now a research project with wonderful, wonderful professors at McGill University and funded by SSHRC. And we're trying to see, you know, how effective is this program? What is the impact that it has? And then lastly, we host storytelling evenings. We go into a virtual reality center here in Montreal called the Centre Phi, the Phi Center, where we get scientists to tell true personal stories about themselves and their research, very much modeled off of Story Collider, which you'll hear more about tomorrow, I think. And so this has been a wonderful way of engaging the local Montreal audience who might not necessarily get to engage with scientists. And so this is a wonderful story by a PhD candidate called Maya Hay, who is just a brilliant communicator. And I thought this quote was just a wonderful capture of what we're really trying to facilitate in this environment. So Maya said, "It always seems like a very benign question. Would you like bread for breakfast or rice for breakfast? But I know as a 5-year-old child that that question sizes me up on my Japaneseness. I don't fit into any culture. I'm not white, I'm not Asian, I'm not other. The thing is, microbes don't fit into one category either." And so here, you know, we have an audience who are not experts in microbes. And as soon as they hear the word microbes, I'm sure, you know, something goes off and says like, I really want to engage with this. However, what Maya has done has brought to the forefront a feeling that is universal, feelings of wanting to be, to belong, feeling of lost identity. And here what that allows for is this connection to be made with the audience, and it allows for the science that is going to come to be more palatable and relatable to them. And then what's really great about podcasting is that, you know, during the lockdown, we had to rethink, okay, like we can't finish one of our documentaries. So what do we do? And so we were able to start mini-sodes talking to experts around the world about how we can communicate accessible and inclusive science during COVID-19. And these are just a few of the experts that we got to talk to. But the format was, you know, the format is incredibly adaptable and malleable. So with our dinky little microphones, we were able to do a show. So why podcasts? You know, if you think about it, radio is, and audio storytelling is one of the most accessible media outlets in the world. 70% of the world, approximately 70% of the world has access to it. I have lived in different places around the world, and I'm always 30 minutes within a community radio station. I have lived in remote areas of Ghana, and I am a 12-minute walk away, or was a 12-minute walk away from a community radio station. So it's very much embedded in our society, right? It's everywhere. It is incredibly democratized, as you'll find out about, or if you don't already know. I don't need a specific license to publish my podcast. And with community radio, everyone is pretty much welcomed to contribute to, you know, to their local station. And it is affordable. I mean, you could use your phone to just record. You don't need all this fancy equipment. And I'm sorry, I have to bring a little bit of academic literature because I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't. And in fact, had to stop myself from doing a whole neuroscience storytelling few slides here. But there is some research showing that compared to video formats, audio is more engaging to audience at the physiological level. So when you hear something, and scientists have placed sensors on folks listening to stories, we see that there's more engagement with your variability in your heart rate. This is one study that you can go to learn more about it. So variability in your heart rate, your sweat, just various physiological measures that show more variability and engagement compared to when you're watching a story on a screen. And one potential reason for that, and it's something that I really love about the audio format, is you actually have to co-create a story with your audience. So you have to be incredibly intentional about your wording, but that has to elicit imagery. So the audience has to produce this image in their head, but it's based on the words that you have provided. So it is this, we don't think about it. We think about it as being a passive process, but it isn't. Like, the audience is doing work here. They're imagining what you're talking about. And there are many different types of podcasts. This is why I was really excited to try out this medium, is that, you can have an interview podcast, you can have a conversational podcast with two people talking, or your friends talking. You can have a solo commentary podcast where you're the only person talking. I mean, you have to be hella charismatic. I mean, you have to be Barack Obama charismatic to be able to pull this off, to talk for 40 minutes into a mic with nobody else. But if you want to do it, hey, go for it. But for me, I was really interested in the storytelling, the kind of mixed investigative journalism, the interviewing of people. So just kind of combining different types of podcasts into one, which, in retrospect, probably wasn't the smartest idea to get to start off with. But I did learn a lot. And, we've had on our podcast dramatic reenactions and wonderful kind of music and just various different types of storytelling techniques. So it's been a wonderful learning curve. And these are, of course, some podcasts that are quite well known in the science realm. I see that some of you have already mentioned things like Radiolab. I think someone mentioned did someone mention Invisibilia? Huh. And I have to go through this a little later on. But I'm sure that, I'm sure that you've heard of many of these. So what is science communication? Just for the sake of this talk, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties of it, but when we're communicating science to non-experts in our field, I mean, that's what generally we're going to refer to as science communication, but it can take many different forms, from communicating science in institutions like a museum to this wonderful new area of science communication, which uses social media, from TikTok to Instagram. But then we also have policy, right? Communicating the importance of science for policy to be made and for us to understand what do we need to do to be safe. Of course, we have these policy briefings now almost every week, if not daily, depending on where you are. And this is not part of our formal education, right? So there's only one accredited master's program here in Canada that does science communication, which is Laurentian University. And for the most part, and this is my experience, you don't really know where to turn to get this experience. And so there have been workshops that have been popping up. I'd like to specifically highlight CompSciCon Canada because I'm biased and I am a co-creator of this event, where it's a 3-day workshop that's founded on a model that started at Harvard University in 2013, which gets graduate students from around Canada for free to learn about science communication, the different types of communications, network, and it's, look out for an application soon, because we're going into, I think, our 3rd year of ComSciCon Canada, and it's since branched out to be more regional. So you'll have different ComSciCon chapters in the West Coast, in Quebec, in the GTA, and so the science communication field has really been quite grassroots here in Canada. And I just also want to highlight, and my sincere apologies, because I should have put Farah Kayser's credit here, but Farah, a wonderful science communicator who you'll hear from tomorrow, put together a wonderful beginner's guide to science communication opportunities in Canada, because they're all over the place. They're siloed, they're not centralized. And so if you want to start, this is a wonderful way to get a scope and understanding of the field. And I really want to highlight here that science communication is central to democracy, right? I mean, we obviously want to talk about really fun stuff about science. I mean, I love talking about octopuses. I mean, you could talk about animal poo. I mean, it's just inherently, science is just cool. But I mean, there's a lot of benefits, whether it's as a researcher, getting collaborations or partnerships, or funding. But at its crux, I just want everyone to think about and reflect on that it's a democratic right for us to have access to information and to be able to utilize it in a way that benefits us and our community. So what is inclusive science communication? I'm seeing that I only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to do an activity, but I think I'm going to try to power through these slides a little bit more. So, there's no formal definition, but I do really love this from Canfield and Menezes at the Metcalf Institute at Rhode Island, and they say science communication approaches that intentionally center diverse voices and identities, especially those that have been and or remain marginalized in STEM, practice, research, training, and engagement, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, age, ability, gender, identity, sexuality, and citizenship status. And they really highlight a few key terms here. So intersectionality, and this is something that we were founded on as Broad Science, is Black feminism. So this is coined, this term is coined from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a Black feminist legal scholar. And when we talk about intersectionality, I've seen it misinterpreted in the science world to mean different fields intersecting, but really intersectionality is a way to question power. And so here, what you want to think about is how is one's multitude of identities, their race, their gender, combined to lead to the experiences, including that of discrimination and privilege that they have, right? Is this gonna go? There we go. And I think what we default back to with Broad Science is to engage meaningfully with the public, we need to reflect on the systems and the institutions that have the power to produce and disseminate scientific knowledge. So when I look at different perspectives, I'm saying, okay, who has the power to ask these questions? Who doesn't have a voice in this story? And that's what I'm interested in talking about. Okay. So generally, we hear about mistrust quite a lot. I am more interested in understanding how the world or how people believe they perceive science, if they feel like they belong in science. And so for the most part, from a multitude of different surveys, which I'm not going to go through, we are seeing that individuals don't feel like they know much about science. They don't feel that they're engaged with, that scientists are elitist, these people in an ivory tower, not the person that you sit on a bus or go to the grocery store with. But then there's this overwhelming feeling of, I want to learn more. I want to know more. And I want to put an asterisk here to say that, like, a lot of these surveys that you'll hear about, and it drives me wild, is, then it's not disaggregated. So when we talk about things like vaccine uptake, or, I don't like the word hesitancy, but it's used quite a lot in media. But when we talk about trust, a lot of this data isn't disaggregated. So here, of course there's mistrust in science. Are you kidding? As like a Black and Indigenous person who's lived in Canada, yeah, of course. And so there's no one way that we're going to solve this. There are a few steps that you can take. And so with broad science, what we do want is to co-create, these episodes and knowledge with our community to highlight the diversity of expertise that's out there. But ultimately, this is going to be a large systemic shift in science communication that's going to change, and is going to take place for decades in order to get to a place where people feel like they can be trusted, or that we as science communicators and scientists and the systems can be trusted. So that was my caveat about mistrust. Pretty much already tackled this question here. And Tanya did a way better job than I could at giving a wonderful explainer as to why that was. Now, I want to just give you a few tips in the next 5 minutes. And sorry to the Raw Talk team for going over here a little bit, but a few tips to think about when you're communicating. So we're living in an infodemic in addition to a pandemic. And we know that false information is spreading quickly. If you want to learn, this is out of the scope of my talk, but if you want to learn more about some resources and tips to tackle misinformation, I would highly recommend going to the Metcalf Institute and the News Literacy Project modules that they've created. But what I'm noticing more and more, especially with communication, even in podcasts, is the deficit model, which in academia we call the deficit model. It's just like throwing information at people because we don't think they have the right information to make sound decisions. But if a person doesn't believe in, let's say, climate change, is it because they don't have the right information, right? And so I think where we need to start shifting our conversations with communicating is that we need to understand the way that we understand our world, and science included, is shaped by social, cultural, and political networks, right? And so this idea of just throwing numbers at people, it's not going to work. I also want to encourage you to talk about uncertainty. There is no overwhelming evidence in the literature to say that if we talk about something in a way that shows it's uncertain, that literally talks about the scientific process as it's meant to be, which there is no certainty, right? That it hinders people's ability to understand what they're reading. So how are you including the scientific process as it really is in your work? And I think this is incredibly important in the context of education. You know, when you're a kid, you open up your science textbook and all you see are people who have won Nobel Prizes, people who have gotten it right. And that is really harmful to how kids develop a relationship with science. And they think, well, I'm not going to be able to be Einstein, so what's the point? And what we really do need to talk about more of openly, and particularly, I think, will probably lead to increasing trust within our communities, is like, yeah, science doesn't always get it right. You know, as a PhD student, I spend 98% of my time just going, well, none of this is statistically relevant and none of this is meaningful, right? So we need to be able to convey that. I want to talk very briefly about accessibility. Is under a paywall. People can't actually access science. People can't access good critical reporting. I was actually just about to look at a story about COVID on the Toronto Star and couldn't access it, and I'm not about to pay for a subscription. Sorry, I think the Toronto Star is great, but you know, good critical reporting is really inaccessible at the moment, let alone the actual scientific information. You know, most of, I'm just going to hit on a few points here, but most of science, in addition to science communication, is in English, right? So, we need to start shifting as to how can we start working with other communities so science is accessible to everyone, but also how do we work with communities so that they can create their own science stories that has reach here in the English world. Of course, transcribing and closed captioning is great and should be done. So thank you, Raw Talk, for doing that. And just thinking about internet access here, we've got, horrific stats as to who can access their basic right of internet access. Most First Nations communities don't have stable internet access. And so we need to start thinking about that as groups of science communicators. Now, for the sake of time and for wanting to have a discussion, I'm not going to go through all of these tips and tricks that I kind of set up here. But I will say that, the way that we communicate and something that was really hard for me to understand is that it isn't how we write an academic paper. It really is, as we say in academia, this inverse triangle, and this is very condensed. But we really need to just start off with this so what? Why do people care about what you're talking about? You need to hook them right away. You can't just start off with a background and context, and I'm sure that you all know this. Something else to think about is jargon. I know folks roll their eyes when they hear jargon because they're like, I don't do that, but it's so ingrained in the way that we talk as scientists. And we know there is evidence to show that as soon as a word comes up that is jargon, even if it's explained, people feel like they don't understand the story, but their affiliation to science, the way that they think about science, diminishes. It becomes negative, right? And it's just like basic words that we use that we don't even think about. And I'll send you guys this this graph here that I really love. And then another thing that I want to highlight is we use a lot of numbers. And I mean, obviously it's great. We need to show that there's evidence behind what we're saying. But why do we care? What is the significance of this? And so I would love for you to think about using your data more wisely. I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about the death rates in the States. And I've almost, it's awful to say, but you become habituated to these numbers. And then someone on the podcast said, that's all of Atlanta that just went away. And I have to sit down because a lot of my family's in Atlanta. And that just hit me. That was like visceral, right? So think about how do you frame your numbers to convey a point. Okay. So, I'm more than happy to go through like more kind of more specific advice about, word choices, literary devices. But I think for the most part, I'm gonna stop here because I do want to have a conversation with you all and talk to you about what you're interested in. I will just end on, you have resources to make your work more inclusive. There is no excuse to not be citing diverse experts. They are there. You can go to Request a Woman Scientist. I am happy to send this to you. The BlackInNeuro website has almost 500 profiles that have been submitted for folks who work in neuroscience or neuro-related fields. So just think about the perspectives and how you're highlighting it because they are there. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you. As folks who are in graduate students, you do have the ability to make a difference. Your work can matter. And, it's a trial and error process. Yeah, so feel free to ask me your questions, but like I said, I'm just gonna stop there and save these slides if you have any questions specific to them.
Awesome. Thank you, Rackeb, for your really fascinating talk. We do have some questions for you lined up. The first one is from KL, and they ask, how did you reach out and develop relationships with people in the community?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, for instance, we reached out to someone who wrote a blog about their experience about taking a 23andMe test. And just that was a cold email. And they got back to us and we started talking on the phone. And that's how that relationship developed. We did a episode on Me Too, the Me Too movement in academia. And we went to a support group, a Facebook support group that one of our members was actually already on, and they asked the question if anyone would be willing to share their story. And we had a few people reach out to us who didn't want to be a part of the actual recording of the podcast, but wanted to just share their experience so their perspective could be highlighted in the podcast. And that was really crucial to how we shaped the script and the narrative. And then ultimately, the person who we did end up recording, we did not use their real name or any identifying information. But there are a few ways. And then sometimes it's academics that we know. Like, you know, the trailer that we played at the beginning, I mean, really selfishly, I get to talk to the coolest experts. I mean, I've spoken to Alondra Nelson, who is now a mentor of mine, who became the deputy director of science and society for the Biden administration. Like, oh my God. And they really help shape how and make us understand how we talk about the narratives or how we approach the narrative. So there are a lot of different ways. And sometimes it comes from my mom, who's like, hey, I want to know about this. And I'm like, cool. We're going to put that in the podcast, Mom.
Awesome. We have here a question from Mariko. Were there any resources that you could recommend for someone who wants to start their own podcast with no recording or audio background?
And this is why I have extra slides. Yes. The not so secret slides. I just talk a lot and I just miss the mark with minutes. But yes, the two biggest resources that really helped me is the Open Notebook, which is, I think, for anyone who wants to be a science journalist or science writer, has amazing tips. And transom.org, bless this organization. They have all the tips about tech, how to script, giving you access to different audio journalists, so you can actually talk to them and learn from their experiences. So these two resources were like the Bible for us, honestly.
Okay. We have here a question from Mel. How did you balance your graduate studies with creating this platform?
That is a great question, and I'm as I mentioned, I'm still a PhD student, and I don't think I balance it really well. I'm not gonna lie to you. I wear many hats, and I'm tired a lot. But I would like to say that you don't owe anything to anybody, and I had to remember this to myself. Like, I was sometimes staying up till 4 a.m. to produce something for Broad Science. And now, as you know, I've gotten older and more mature in this process. I mean, Broad Science is currently on a year hiatus because I honestly could not keep up with everything. And so I think you need to just check in with yourself to say, am I able to do this? What is my priorities? And the science communication stuff can wait. You know, my number one priority right now is graduating. But when I was working on BlackInNeuro, my number one priority was actually amplifying Black voices. And so, yeah, I mean, it took me a little longer to get my chapter into my thesis supervisor, but I think that was the right call for me.
Okay. We have a question from Anam. What advice do you have for those of us in the lab but don't have a position of authority to be able to speak up when we see that the science is not inclusive?
The science that's in your lab? Sorry, do you mind re-asking that question?
Okay. I believe that it's more so the science. Well, we could say both, like it's sort of in the lab or just even in general. If you're not in a position of authority to speak out, how should one feel about trying to do that?
Yeah. So I want to say that if you are in a position where you think speaking out could be harmful to you, please, don't do it. I always say that you should amplify voices and that you should, speak out. But if it's going to be harmful to you, please, don't do it, and find a community that understands first and foremost. That's what I did with some of the spaces, is that I didn't feel safe enough to speak out. And so I went and I found a community elsewhere and built something that I never thought would be as impactful as it is now. However, you can do certain smaller acts that might be deemed as kind of less, transparent in your mission, I guess. So, if you're at a lab meeting and you have to pick a paper from someone who's a Black scientist or transgender scientist. Or, maybe you can send your lab mates articles about really cool things that you read that have to do with inclusivity in science. So I don't think it often has to be like a stand that you're going to take right then and there and it's confrontational. But, there are small acts that you can do as well.
Okay. We have a question here from Atifa, and she asks, is there an achievement that means the most to you / you are most proud of?
The youth program, 100%. Thank you for that. Thank you for all your questions, by the way, and thank you for that question. We started off as a one-day event, just because it was Science Odyssey Week. I don't know if any of you know, but the government hosts a week of innovation in Canada and science, and there's different events. And so we were asked if, Broad Science could do something, and we're like, it would be really fun to get kids into, as a camp counselor, I was like, let's do something for kids. And it was so quickly put together, and we put the registration page up, and within literally half a day, it was full. And parents were emailing us, schools were emailing us. They're like, no, can you do this again? And so what was supposed to be a one-day event has turned into almost 3 years. And to hear from the kids, we have audio recordings of the outcome, the impact that kids share with us. And they talk about being heard for the first time in their life. Being able to talk about things that are really difficult that they don't want to bring up in class or with their parents, and having that space to do it here. To me, if I were to stop now, that would give me the power to carry through for the rest of my life. I'm so happy with that. Yeah.
Awesome. We have another question from Jesse. Do you have any recommendations for podcasts who are looking to ensure they include diverse guests and perspectives about how to implement and evaluate their progress?
How to implement and evaluate? That's a great question. And it's actually one of the biggest gaps in science communication is we have no literature of how to, to develop and evaluate outcomes. And so I think where you need to start with your podcast is, what does success mean to you? What do you operationally define as success? For me, doing those interviews with those kids afterwards to see, hey, what did you like about the program that we did? What did you not like? What are some things that you would like to see? How did you feel about it? Getting those anecdotes, qualitative anecdotes, and yeah, you can send out questionnaires, and get more quantitative information. But for me, the qualitative information has been incredibly helpful. And sometimes we get something wrong on the podcast. It totally happens. And we get a DM from someone saying actually, you might want to consider this. And that, and moving forward, our podcast is made way better because of that comment and that person who was able to reach out to us.
Okay. All right. One final question, because this one's coming from
Okay.
And she's actually just wanted to sort of clarify a concept about something you had on the slide where she asks, what don't you like about the term vaccine hesitancy?
So, there's incredible experts that could speak more to this than I can. But I think on a whole, it's just an incredibly negative term. So the World Health Organization released a report that showed overall people actually do take vaccines and do think that they're that they have efficacy. As a whole, as a society, we actually do. We have a high vaccine uptake, right? And so when we start highlighting people who are hesitant, I think that's also linked to anti-vaxxers. And that's linked to a whole ideology that should be completely separate from people who, yes, do have hesitancy about the vaccine. But I think that the way that we're linking it right now in our language is not completely correct. And I should say, like, as someone who works in an autism field, who talks to parents who have questions, I mean, these are not folks who have conspiracy theories, right? So I think just the term has been misused and doesn't fully capture our understanding of vaccine uptake around our world.
Okay. All right. Well, with that then, thank you, Rackeb, for this really intriguing and interesting talk that you gave us today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a great time.